Thank you very much, Your Honor. First of all, I'd like to thank the attorneys, counsel for both the prosecution and defense for their zealous advocacy and for the presentation to us of thousands of pages of documents disclosed by both sides, and for their skillful examination and cross-examination of the witnesses and their closing submission. I certainly want to thank the witnesses, both factual and expert, who came here to testify before us and who testified by video link. We announced that we will be posting on our website whatever indictment that we do confirm. And of course, this is not a trial, it's an indictment process, a confirmation process similar to what the ICC would conduct and will conduct in the Coney case this fall, done under the provisions of ICC statute Article 61.
Yes, my name's Lima Nguyen. I'm an Australian barrister. I practice in the Northern Territory of Australia, but I also practice internationally. And that's one of the reasons I was able to get involved in this case.
What is happening related to the China Tribunal?
So in the Court of the Citizens of the World, I'm part of a prosecution team. I'm part of 3 prosecutors who were tasked with investigating open source materials, speaking with witnesses, gathering evidence, compiling a case file and assessing the evidence to determine whether or not there was sufficient evidence for us to draft charges on an indictment. And we have found that there is sufficient evidence on our count for 12 different counts in relation to Xi Jinping. The purpose of this tribunal is for the judges to assess the evidence and to determine whether or not there are substantial grounds to believe that certain international atrocity crimes have been committed which should be committed for trial. So it's not a trial, it's a pre-trial hearing.
Okay. So
I've been working on the case of crimes against humanity in Tibet, and then my colleagues were running the case of aggression against Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan and Australia, and then the other case was genocide and crimes against humanity against the Uyghur minority group in Xinjiang.
you're working on the Tibetan case. You met with the Tibetan expert and also the victims, including Golojik Mela, Aturuan Chinla, and Nimala Mula, and against the Xi Jinping's crime in humanity.
I've been able to work with both expert witnesses as well as fact or victim witnesses. It's been a very interesting experience. So the first victim witness who I spoke with was Dondup Wanchen. He is a friend of Mr. Jigme Golek, I believe, and they both were involved in the making of the film called Leaving Fear Behind. Dondup was arrested for his role in this film, and he was imprisoned for 6 years and 3 months. He eventually left Tibet and now lives in the United States. He was the first witness that I spoke to, and I found his story to be really moving, much as I have found Nima Lamo's account and Mr. Jigme Golek's account as well to be very touching, because I think when you look at the stories of great difficulty, great challenges, severe deprivations of human rights, amounting to persecution at law, and the attack upon human dignity that these victims have to recount, it's hard not to be moved by their stories. But it's not just that, it's about the courage to value your own human dignity, to value your own life and freedom, to leave everything that you know behind, to seek freedom outside. And Dondup Wanchen, I used what he said. So one of the things that I had read about him was his press award speech, where he said, freedom is more important than life itself. And I wanted to make that a theme in the questioning of witnesses here. I asked him about that, and I asked him about why did you say that? In the closing submissions for the Tibet case, I used what he said in my closing. And I thought it was really important to highlight that. That's the theme, isn't it, of what's happening in Tibet. Yeah, so the crimes that have been charged under the indictment in relation to Tibet are framed as crimes against humanity. There's 3 crimes against humanity. One, which is count 2, is the forcible transfer of children and their separation from their families to be placed into state-run institutions such as colonial boarding schools. 2 is imprisonment and physical deprivations of liberties, and that's to do with political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. And 3 is persecution, and persecution is a much broader crime base because it requires proof of severe deprivations of fundamental human rights. In the case of Tibet, it is very much tied in with the crime against humanity of imprisonment, because it's to do with political prisoners, their detention, their arrests, the reasons that they're arrested, and it has to be in law for us to establish this crime, that it has to be based on matters that are core to their identity. So in the case of Tibet, it's religion, it's ethnicity, it's race, and nationality comes into it as well. So these crimes are very technical. It's not like an assault in the street where you can prove that someone punched someone else and that's the assault. In crimes against humanity, you need to establish that there is a civilian population, that they have these characteristics of religion and ethnicity and so on. You have to prove that there's an attack against that civilian population, and it has to be a widespread or systematic attack. That means the scale and gravity of the attack is across the Tibet regions, and also in our case that is a state-sponsored attack. So that makes it systematic. But not only that, because we are dealing with individual criminal responsibility, we also have to establish that whatever's happening in the detention camps, at the local police stations, the arrests of people, and how they're treated is actually able to be linked up to the highest leadership, which is Xi Jinping. And so that's why in the presentation of our case, there's been a lot of information about his speeches and state documents and the use of law to persecute people. Those are the things that link between what the victims are experiencing and what the directives are from the most senior people running the country.
Thank you so much for working for the Tibetan case. I also got the opportunity to participate and also to the interpretation, to the ecologic mela. What the Tibetans they need to expect from this pre-trial?
First of all, this is a people's tribunal, so the tribunal itself is not the International Criminal Court. It doesn't have its own enforcement jurisdiction. The purpose of the tribunal is to bring some measure of accountability for horrible things that have happened to victims in circumstances where it is unlikely that Xi Jinping is going to be tried at the International Criminal Court. And the unlikelihood could be because he is a big world political power, because China has, certain veto rights before the Security Council, because there may not be sufficient political will to charge him at the real institutions. So first of all, that's the first limitation, and I think that it's very important for those watching the tribunal to understand that at the end of the process, what we can expect is for the judges to make a decision as to whether they think there's sufficient evidence to confirm the charges that we have brought on indictment for trial. They may decide, yes, we think that there is sufficient evidence there that, you know, there was imprisonment as a crime against humanity against the civilian Tibetan population or persecution. And if they think so, then they can confirm that those charges can go to trial. But that's the limitation of this proceeding. So it's an indictment confirmation hearing. They can also choose to dismiss the charges, or they can decide, well, we don't think that there's enough evidence for this charge, but it seems that, you know, the evidence shows that there's another charge. So they have a few things that they can do. The evidentiary standard is very, very low. It is substantial grounds to believe. And the prosecution, of course, takes a position that there has been ample evidence to show that these kinds of abuses did occur, that they amount to crimes against humanity. And, you know, in my submission, the evidence goes beyond the legal test, which is substantial grounds to believe. It rises above that. So I do hope that the outcome is that the judges will find that there is sufficient evidence to confirm the matter for trial.
If this case is successful, what will be the next one?
So if the case is successful, because it's just a people's tribunal, it will not actually go to trial.
Okay.
So the outcome, if it is successful, would be charges are confirmed at this low bar, at this low evidentiary standard. And I guess, you know, that has a role to play as well in terms of highlighting international crimes to the global community, giving voice to the Tibetan civilians who are still very much restricted within Tibet itself, and to give some hope that there can be some accountability.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lema, for joining to the Talk podcast and also the working for the Tibetan case for a very, very long time. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to work with you, Juk. Thank you for your own service to this process. I know you've been involved as an interpreter, and I can see that for the victims and for the translators and interpreters, it's actually been quite a meaningful process because, you know, you all have your own stories, where you came from and, you know, what happened to your families as well. So it's been an honour to work with you as well.
Mr. Ashik, thank you so much for joining to the Talk podcast.
I am a criminal defense attorney. That means that I represent people who are charged or are at risk of being charged with a whole variety of kinds of crimes. And so when those people need someone to stand beside them and speak for them, I do that.
What is your role during this China Tribunal?
Well, during this tribunal, the idea has been that we would make a dramatic presentation of what's called a confirmation hearing, so that people can understand what one aspect of international criminal law might look like. So this isn't a trial, it's a confirmation hearing. And what that means is that the people who play the roles of prosecutors propose to file a charge against Xi Jinping. And before a prosecutor is able to actually file that charge, we have a hearing, at which time the prosecution has to present some evidence to explain why there's enough evidence for a charge to go forward. If there's not enough evidence, the charge can't go forward. If they don't have one piece of evidence that they need, the charge can't go forward. So they have to put the whole puzzle together in a way that a judge can then decide that there either is or is not enough evidence. And so that's what the prosecutor does. And what the defense attorney does is look at that evidence. The prosecutor argues there's enough evidence, and the defense attorney will argue there's not enough evidence, or that the kind of charge that is being made is not appropriate for the circumstances. So, for instance, in this case, if the charge had been that China dropped a nuclear bomb in Tibet, well, we know that didn't happen, right? So the prosecution would not be able to prove that conduct. The prosecutor has made their demonstration of what evidence they have. I've had an opportunity to test the evidence and say, well, there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that, there's a problem with him, there's a problem with him, and perhaps there are elements of the crime charged that have not been satisfied. And then we make our arguments like we did today to the judge, and the judges will make a decision in 25 minutes.
Tibet. What is your conclusion?
My view is that it was not sufficient.
As the court heard this week, the civilian people of Tibet have experienced widespread and systematic attacks, including attempts to erase their cultural, linguistic, and religious practices and identity, restrictions on free expression of opinion and belief, on their movement, of torture, and a large number of Tibetan children being forcibly moved to Chinese-run boarding schools. The testimony and the evidence presented to court highlight the systematic and organized nature of these practices by the accused. As such, the present session, and I will be looking at whether there are substantial grounds to indict the accused on count 2, that is crime against humanity or forcible transfer of children. Count 3, the crime against humanity of imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty. And count 4, which is a crime against humanity of imprisonment or persecution. In addition to the NCC statute, attention is also on whether violations were committed under customary international law. The court heard of specific instances that I will set out briefly below. First, we heard from victims and expert testimony on the implementation of the colonial boarding schools and its impact on Tibetan children and their families, the psychological and emotional trauma and the long-term impact on Tibetan identity. Previously, subjects taught in the Tibetan language saw a change of policy under the leadership of the accused, with education presently being solely in the Chinese language. The court heard evidence indicating to at least 1 million Tibetan children affected by this policy. It is, as a result, children of Tibetan minorities are forced to complete education in Mandarin Chinese. This has resulted in Tibetan children losing their ability to communicate with their parents and their families in their Tibetan language and further contributing to the assimilation of the Tibetan identity. Secondly, we heard of evidence that speaks to the targeting of Tibetan monasteries. This has been on multiple fronts, including the destruction of several monasteries and violence targeting Tibetan monks and nuns, restrictions placed on Tibetans' access to religious sites and religious gatherings, changing the practice of Tibetan Buddhism to Chinese Buddhism, persecution of Tibetans for religious activities honoring the Dalai Lama or possessing his image, Such practices can be viewed as a deliberate policy aimed at dismantling Tibetan religious and cultural identity. Thirdly, we heard evidence that speaks to multiple forms of restrictions on free expression of opinion and belief, on movement, assembly, and association. Further evidence indicated to other serious violations, including the use of torture, that includes the denial of basic services to prisoners and reports of enforced disappearances when families were unaware of the whereabouts of political prisoners.
The judges are concerned. Everybody. Every professor, every religious person, every expert have their biases at one level or another. We all have certain beliefs and certain prejudices. So the issue is not whether people have biases or prejudices. The issue is not whether they belong to a particular religion, whether they believe in particular religions or not, whether they have a particular way of life or not. The issue is whether in their reasoning, their own biases to intrude upon the appropriateness of their conclusion.